Welcome to the deep dive. In science today, especially in fields like geosciences, where we're just swimming in digital data and relying so heavily on these complex computer computations, well, simply publishing a traditional paper, it feels like it isn't quite enough anymore.
It really doesn't capture the whole picture, does it?
No, because the real core of the research, it involves so many dynamic digital pieces. You've got the raw data itself, the specific software they use for the analysis, the exact, step-by-step process they actually followed to get the results. So how can you possibly make sure that someone else, or heck, even you yourself, months or years down the line, can actually understand exactly what was done and, crucially, build upon that work?
It's a huge shift, really, from the historical model. The traditional paper format, it was designed for a time dominated by, let's say, wet labs and physical samples.
Right.
Now, so much groundbreaking research happens entirely in the digital realm, and that digital complexity, well, it just doesn't fit neatly into a static PDF.
Exactly. And that digital gap is precisely what we're diving into today. We're taking a deep dive into these really critical concepts of reproducibility and data standards, specifically within the geosciences.
Yeah, and for this deep dive, we've pulled together insights from quite a stack of sources.
Right.
We're looking at papers on reproducibility challenges, things like climate science, subsurface geosciences.
Okay.
We're also exploring visions for what the scientific paper could actually be in the future, and studying work focused on making data and even entire research workflows truly findable and reusable, the Hare principles.
Findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. Got it. So our mission here is really to unpack what makes scientific research genuinely trustworthy in this incredibly data-rich digital age. We want to identify the hurdles, what makes that difficult, and then explore the innovative solutions and best practices that the geosciences community is starting to embrace. Okay, let's unpack this. So jumping right into the challenge, why is making geoscientific research reproducible so uniquely difficult? You mentioned complexity.
Yes, that's ground zero, really. Geoscience is inherently complex. It's such a vast field, spanning the solid earth, the atmosphere, the oceans,
Right.
and drawing on incredibly diverse disciplines, like geochemistry, paleontology, hydrology. It's a long list.
And the toolkit is just as diverse, isn't it? You're using everything from satellites orbiting the planet and climate sensors gathering atmospheric data.
All the way down to electron microscopes, studying tiny rock samples.
Yeah, and massive computer models trying to simulate entire Earth systems. And all of that, it generates data in absolutely vast quantities and, I imagine, wildly different formats.
Precisely. And then you add another layer of complexity because geosciences often mixes methods that are, purely objective, maybe applying laws of physics or chemistry.
Like calculating flow rates or something?
Right, but then it blends that with methods that involve significant interpretation based on prior knowledge and expert judgment.
Ah, okay.
Right.
But like what?
Well, think about how you'd model subsurface fluid flow based on limited drill core data, or interpreting ancient climate signals from ice cores. There's expertise involved, judgment calls.
And that blend, that must be hard to document objectively.
It can be. And you touched on this earlier, the computational methods and the digital artifacts, they're the heart of so much modern research, but they simply aren't fully captured in a traditional print-based paper.
Right.
You can describe your methods section in prose, sure, but you can't really share the live executable code or the complete raw data set effectively that way.
And this gap, it actually shows up in some, pretty stark findings from surveys, right?
It really does. Studies show a significant number of scientists, across various fields actually, struggle to reproduce the results of other people's experiments.
If significant or token.
Well, one eye-opening survey found over 70% of scientists couldn't reproduce others' findings.
Wow. Over 70%. That number feels almost unbelievable. What's driving that kind of failure rate?
It seems to be a mix of factors, pointing to some common culprits. Often, the method descriptions in the papers, they just aren't detailed enough.
Okay.
There can be selective reporting of results, maybe only showing the cleanest runs, the ones that perfectly fit the hypothesis. Or sometimes the original study simply lacks sufficient statistical power to draw a firm conclusion in the first place.
Are there particular flavors of these problems that seem to hit, say, subsurface geoscience especially hard? The sources mentioned that?
Yes, they did. The sources highlight some specific challenges there. For instance, clearly separating the expert interpretation from the raw data can be really tricky.
I can see that.
Access to the exact code used for complex modeling or analysis is often limited, or maybe the code exists but isn't shared.
Right.
There's also inherent conceptual uncertainty when you're trying to understand conditions kilometers beneath the surface based on, just a few boreholes or seismic lines.
Yeah, you're inferring a lot.
A huge amount. And sometimes there's just a lack of detailed, commonly agreed upon methodology frameworks for specific types of analysis in the subsurface.
It sounds like beyond the individual frustration of not being able to reproduce something, there's a huge systemic inefficiency here.
Absolutely. Significant effort is wasted when these research products that read the data, the code, aren't made available in a usable format. Someone else might spend months, literally months, trying to reconstruct what could have been shared directly.
And that must create massive barriers to synthesis, right? Trying to combine knowledge across different studies or data sets.
Oh, completely. Even just combining data from multiple sources becomes extremely time-consuming and difficult when that data and its associated metadata, the information about the data, aren't standardized or well-documented. It's like trying to fit together puzzle pieces from different boxes without the pictures.
Okay, so that paints a pretty clear picture of the challenge. Given these difficulties, what is the scientific community, particularly in geosciences, actually striving towards? What's the vision for the future here?
Well, the vision goes well beyond simply being able to tick a box that says, yep, this result to be reproduced.
Okay.
The real goal is to enhance multiple levels of verification. There's reproducibility, which can mean getting consistent results, maybe with different teams using different data or methods. Then there's replicability, that's usually a different team using the same method and the same data.
Okay, a direct rerun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And repeatability, which is the same team, same conditions, same data, basically checking your own work reliably.
So it's like a whole spectrum of trust and verification. And for any of that to be possible, transparency sounds like it must be the absolute bedrock.
It is. It fundamentally is. Making the data, the software, the specific computational methods, and all the relevant documentation openly accessible, that the essential prerequisite for any of these levels of verification.
Right.
The sources really emphasize that transparency acts as a critical layer of quality control.
How so?
Well, it also creates an incentive for authors to produce more robust, verifiable results right from the outset.
Because if you know your work can be easily scrutinized, easily checked, you're probably going to be more careful about how you do it and document it.
Exactly. You're less likely to cut corners, perhaps. Ultimately, these efforts are about building more trustworthy and reliable research outcomes. That's the bottom line.
And that vision, it includes not just the final paper, but making openly accessible all the digital pieces behind it.
Yes, the whole package. The goal is to make all research products, the data, the code, the workflows, the documentation, readily available.
To whom?
To fellow scientists, obviously, but also to students, to policymakers, even to the public. This enables others to fully understand and, importantly, directly build upon published work. That's how you accelerate scientific discovery.
Makes sense.
It also significantly facilitates collaboration, whether that's within academia or between academic researchers and industry partners who might want to apply the findings.
It also feels like there's a drive towards maybe democratization of science here. Leveraging public resources and making publicly funded research genuinely accessible back to the public interest.
Absolutely. That's a key motivator. And increasingly, funding agencies are making this openness a requirement, not just a nice to have.
Oh, really? Like who?
Well, in the U.S., for instance, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the OSDP, has mandated public access to research products from federally funded work.
Wow. Okay.
And agencies like the NSF, NASA, NOAA, the USGS, they're all actively implementing plans requiring these research products to be openly published and shared. The mandates are coming.
It's interesting that this movement feels so current, driven by the digital age, but the sources point out it's actually not a brand new problem. This push towards transparency and verifiability, it has roots going back decades.
That's absolutely right. Researchers who've studied this evolution, they trace the trajectory of computational reproducibility through at least 4 earlier distinct efforts that have kind of contributed to where we are today.
Okay, let's trace those roots. What were they?
Well, the earliest roots, you can find them in computer science, mathematics, and statistics. Back then, the focus was mainly on sharing software libraries for review and distribution among peers.
Makes sense. If you build a useful computational tool, you want people to use it, test it, maybe even improve it.
Exactly. Then, maybe in the 1980s and 90s, the replication standard movement gained ground, particularly in fields like political science and economics.
Replication standard,
Yeah.
what did that involve?
This really pushed authors to share their underlying code and data specifically so that others could evaluate and try to replicate the published research findings.
So demanding the raw materials needed to actually rerun the analysis and see if you get the same numbers. Checking the math, essentially.
Precisely that, verifying the claims.
Mm.
Then the third movement, interestingly, was termed reproducible research. And this was actually initiated by geoscientists back in the early 1990s.
Okay, geoscientists were ahead of the curve on this specific reproducible research idea. That's fascinating. What was their focus?
Yes. It surprised me, too. This movement, which was later adopted in fields like statistics and signal processing, had this very specific, almost visionary goal at the time. Creating a system where the computational artifacts linked to a publication, the code, the data, could be used to reproduce figures, tables, and results by, essentially, pressing a single button.
Ah, the mythical single-button dream automated reproducibility, even back then.
Exactly. The Holy Grail, even in the 90s. And finally, the repeatability movement originated more specifically within the computer science community, particularly in database systems, focusing on the ability to obtain the exact same results under the exact same conditions. Consistency.
So these different threads, sharing tools, sharing data and code for verification, the dream of automated reproduction from artifacts and ensuring you get identical results under identical conditions. They've all sort of converged and informed this modern push we're seeing now in geosciences and beyond.
Yes, exactly. They built the intellectual and practical foundation for the current, more integrated efforts.
Okay, so moving from that vision and the history to the practical reality, how is the geosciences community actually implementing these ideas? What concrete steps are being taken right now?
Well, it's really a multi-pronged approach. Policies and initiatives are definitely a key driver. Journals, for instance, are increasingly implementing mandatory open data policies.
Okay, but does just having a policy actually make a difference in practice? Do people follow them?
Studies suggest they can have a significant impact, at least on availability. One study looked at the journal Cognition after they implemented a mandatory open data policy.
And what happened?
The percentage of articles with statements indicating data availability, just saying the data is available, jumped from about 25% to 78%.
Wow, okay, that's a huge increase in just claiming the data is there. But does availability equal reusability? Can people actually use it?
And that's the absolutely critical distinction. The same study found that while those statements of availability went way up, the percentage of articles where the data was actually reusable, meaning someone else could realistically download it, understand it, and work with it, only increased from around 22% to 62%.
So still a big jump, but a significant gap remains.
Exactly. Simply putting data somewhere doesn't guarantee someone else can easily work with it. You might find a file, but without proper documentation or structure, it's still effectively a black box.
Right. It's like finding a box of scattered IKEA parts, but with no instructions. You have the parts, but...
Precisely.
Mm.
Conference initiatives are also playing a role here. Things like the Climate Informatics Reproducibility Challenge, CORG23 they called it.
What did they do?
They specifically push participants to create interactive reproducible publications using tools like Jupyter Notebooks. These kinds of challenges are great because they help identify real-world hurdles and foster the adoption of best practices in a practical setting.
It sounds like there isn't one single universal way everyone is tackling this reproducibility issue.
No, definitely not. These reproducibility initiatives, they differ quite a bit.
In what ways?
In what exactly they mandate authors to share, what aspects are actually reviewed during the publication process, who does the reviewing, is it editors, peer reviewers, maybe dedicated reproducibility reviewers, and importantly, how these efforts are incentivized or rewarded.
And it's not just within geosciences.
No, there are also broader cross-disciplinary efforts like the UK Reproducibility Network, for example, that are supporting this kind of work across many fields.
One really fascinating concept highlighted in the sources is the Geoscience Paper of the Future, or GPF. That sounds like a fundamental rethinking of what a scientific publication even is.
It really is. It's a very comprehensive vision. It aims to fully document, share, and cite all components of the research process.
All components, meaning?
Not just the paper narrative, but the underlying data, the specific software used, and the entire computational lineage, what's often called provenance. Where did the results come from, step by step? And it explicitly goes beyond just making results reproducible to fully embracing open science practices more broadly.
So it's less like reading a description of an experiment and much more like getting the entire digital lab setup delivered to you.
And that's a great way to put it, precisely. Key elements include sharing all these components in public, trusted repositories.
Not just on a personal website.
Right. Using open licenses that explicitly state how others can reuse the material. Providing detailed metadata so people can actually find and understand the components.
Metadata, again, critical.
Absolutely. Assigning persistent, unique identifiers like DOIs to everything. Data, software, workflows, provenance records. And crucially, citing all those resources properly in the paper, not just citing other papers. Give credit to the data and the code.
And the GPF vision, it makes a point of differentiating between inspectability and reproducibility. What's that about?
Yes, that's an important nuance. Inspectability means making it easy for someone to simply examine the computational steps taken to get to the results. They can look at the code, see the data transformations, understand the logic.
Okay, so just looking under the hood.
Exactly. Reproducibility is the higher bar. That's the practical ability to actually rerun those experiments yourself and get the same or statistically equivalent result.
Which might be harder.
It can be, depending on the complexity of the software needed, etc. But the GPF vision emphasizes that enabling inspectability should always be a straightforward goal for any author sharing computational results. Even if full push-button reproducibility is challenging, let people see how you did it.
Makes sense. Okay, so beyond rethinking the paper format itself, a huge piece of this puzzle is tackling the data monster. Data standards and repositories seem absolutely fundamental.
They are, utterly. To make data findable, understandable, and reusable, it needs structure and standardization. Now, formal accredited standards exist for some data types, but they can be slow to develop, they don't cover everything, and they aren't always practical for the sheer diversity of geoscientific data.
So the community isn't just sitting around waiting for formal standards bodies to catch up?
Not entirely, no. There's a strong push for community-driven reporting formats. For example, repositories like ESSD.E, which focuses on ecosystem and subsurface data. They work directly with scientists in those communities to develop practical reporting formats for diverse data types. They figure out together what are the required fields, what are optional but helpful fields, based on community consensus.
And metadata is the key to making all that structured data understandable and findable later on, right? You keep mentioning it.
Absolutely vital. You can't overstate its importance. Documenting data requires both general metadata, the basic who, what, when, where, why, how of the data collection. Right, and also detailed domain-specific metadata. Information that only an expert in that particular subfield would know is important or even understand how to provide. This deep metadata is what allows someone searching for data later to actually understand if a data set is relevant to their question and what's really contained within it.
Are there specific repositories tailored just for geosciences?
Oh, yes. Platforms like Pangea, for instance, are highly specialized repositories for geosciences data. They cover many subdisciplines, from oceanography to paleoclimatology to sedimentology.
And they're built for reuse.
Yes, they're built with detailed metadata structures designed specifically to enable researchers to find and reuse data, sometimes from studies that were originally conducted for very different purposes. The rich metadata makes that possible.
And what about long-term access? To avoid those dreaded broken links when someone leaves an institution or project website disappears.
Long-term archiving is crucial. Standard practice now involves recommending archiving final versions of data sets and reporting formats in certified long-term repositories.
Places designed for preservation.
Exactly. And using version control platforms like GitHub for ongoing development of code or data products is also key. And of course, assigning persistent unique identifiers like DOIs to data sets ensures they can be found and cited reliably, even if the hosting location changes years later. The DOI points to the right place.
Okay, so we have the data, hopefully well documented and archived.
Right.
What about the analysis itself, the software used, and the sequence of steps, the workflow?
Yeah, that's the other crucial piece. It's really important to share all the code used, not just, say, the major climate simulation models.
What else counts?
Any scripts used for data cleaning, transformation, quality control, statistical analysis, or even just generate the final figures in the paper, all of it.
Why share the small stuff too?
Because sharing this code benefits the whole community. It reduces redundant development effort. Someone else doesn't have to write the same script from scratch. And it improves code quality through collaborative review and reuse. More eyes on the code helps find bugs.
So where should scientists be putting their code? Is GitHub the main place?
Public code repositories like GitHub, GitLab, SourceForge, Bitbucket. Those are common and good places, especially for active development. There are also domain-specific repositories in geosciences, particularly for larger community models.
Okay.
But the sources emphasize the importance of sharing all the smaller, often custom scripts too, maybe alongside the data they process in a data repository or linked from the paper.
What about older code? You know, the legacy Fortran model from 20 years ago, that still works, but maybe only runs on a specific old operating system?
Yeah, documenting and potentially updating older codes is a significant challenge, no doubt. Sometimes it genuinely requires recreating old software environments or even finding old hardware, which is difficult.
But potentially valuable.
It can be extremely valuable work because these older codes often represent a substantial intellectual investment and might still be the basis for current research or regulatory decisions. Preserving them matters.
Now, to manage these complex analyses involving multiple steps in different bits of software, the sources mention workflow management systems, or WFMS. What are those exactly?
Yes, WFMS. These are basically tools designed to help researchers automate and streamline complex scientific processes. Think of analyses that involve multiple steps, maybe using different software packages where the output of one step becomes the input for the next.
Oh, okay, so they manage the flow.
Exactly. And a major goal now is developing WFMS that embodies those FAIR principles we mentioned earlier, making the workflows themselves findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, especially for geospatial data processing, which is common in geosciences.
How do they achieve that interoperability and reusability? If I build a workflow on my system, how can you run it on yours?
A couple of key ways. One is by using open standards to describe the workflow structure itself, like the Common Workflow Language, CWL.
Okay.
This means a workflow defined using CWL isn't tied to one specific WFMS. It can potentially be run on different systems that understand CWL.
Portability.
Yes. And crucially, they also often use containerization tools like Docker or Singularity.
Ah, containers. Tell me more.
Docker basically encapsulates all the necessary software, libraries, operating system components, and dependencies needed to run a piece of code or a whole workflow into a portable container.
So it packages the entire computational environment needed.
Exactly. This ensures the workflow runs in a consistent environment, regardless of the user's specific computer setup. It solves the "it worked on my machine" problem.
That sounds incredibly useful.
It is. And just like data and code, the goal is to make these workflows findable. This involves sharing the workflow resources, the data inputs, the individual computational components or nodes within the workflow, and the entire workflow definition file.
Where?
In repositories, assigning unique DOIs. One example mentioned using Harvard Dataverse for this. And having user-friendly graphical designers within the WFMS also helps make these complex workflows more accessible for reuse by researchers who might not be expert coders themselves.
Okay, so we've got the data, the software, the tools to manage the workflow. How do you document the precise connection between them? The specific path you took to get from the raw data to the final result. That seems vital.
That's where documentation of provenance comes in, specifically computational provenance. It's the explicit recording and documentation of the specific data used, the sequence of processing steps performed, and the parameters applied at each step to reach a scientific result.
So it's like having an incredibly detailed, automatically generated lab notebook and recipe combined for the computational part.
That's a really good analogy, yes. You're tracing the lineage of the results, step by step.
What needs to be included in that trace?
Things like which specific input data styles were used, which software tools were executed at each stage, the exact versions and configurations of that software, because different versions can give different results, and all the parameter values that were set by the user for each step.
How is that information actually captured? Does the scientist have to write it all down manually?
Ideally, no. Workflow systems can often capture a lot of this provenance information automatically as the workflow runs. They log what happens.
Ah, that's efficient.
It is. If you're not using a WFMS, you might rely on creating detailed trace logs yourself, basically, adding print statements or logging commands within your code that record key information about the computation as it happens. It's more manual, but possible.
And should these provenance records be shared alongside the data and code?
Ideally, yes. The full vision is to publish provenance records in a public repository, assign them unique identifiers like DOIs, and cite them, putting them on par with data and software as first-class research products.
Are there special repositories for provenance yet?
Currently, dedicated repositories specifically designed just for provenance are less common. So a temporary solution often involves publishing them, maybe as structured files, in a general-purpose data repository alongside the other research products.
This all just reinforces the absolute necessity of identifiers and proper citation, doesn't it? It keeps coming up.
Crucially important, persistent, unique identifiers, especially DOIs, digital object identifiers, are needed for basically everything: digital data, software, provenance records, and even individual workflow components or specific case studies built using these workflows.
Why are they so non-negotiable?
Because these IDs are the key to making resources findable over the long term and ensuring they can be reliably linked and accessed even if websites change. They provide a stable reference point.
And they're also key for giving credit where credit is due, right?
Absolutely. Citing data, citing software, citing provenance, citing workflows, it's vital to ensure recognition for the creators of all these different types of research resources, just as we cite papers. This practice is what incentivizes sharing in the first place.
Makes sense.
And for the authors themselves, using persistent unique identifiers like ORCID, Open Researcher and Contributor ID, helps link individual researchers to all their diverse digital research products across different platforms and publications. It connects the person to their work.
Another innovation mentioned in the sources that seems aimed at bringing results more vividly to life is the idea of executable environments. What's that about?
Right. These are ways to package research so that the analysis isn't just described statically, but can potentially be run interactively by the reader or reviewer.
Like what?
Executable research objects like Jupyter Notebooks are probably the most popular example right now. They allow you to interleave live code, the outputs of that code, visualizations, and explanatory text all in one document.
I've seen those. They make walking through someone's analysis much more intuitive. You can see the steps.
Yes, exactly. And technologies like R Markdown take that concept even further by weaving code, like R or Python, and prose together in a way that can automatically generate reproducible documents, reports, websites, even entire papers where the figures and tables are generated live from the code.
And containers fit in here too.
Yes. Software containers, which we mentioned for workflows, are also key for executable environments. They handle all the underlying software dependencies, making it possible, in theory, to regenerate results with just a few commands, getting closer to that single-button reproducibility idea we talked about earlier.
So that push-button reproducibility is becoming more and more achievable, technically at least, with these tools.
It is becoming more feasible, yes. But even without full containerization, creating a perfectly executable environment, simply providing clear, step-by-step instructions for setting up the required software and executing the analysis workflows is critically important for enabling others to follow along and verify the work. Good documentation still matters immensely.
Okay, so we've talked through a lot of the technical solutions, the tools, the policies, the formats, the standards. But this isn't just about technology, is it? The sources emphasize there's a significant human and cultural side to this whole transformation.
Absolutely. You can have the best tools in the world, but if the culture doesn't support their use, they won't be adopted. Incentives matter enormously here.
What kind of incentives?
Modifying assessment frameworks, how we evaluate researchers for hiring, promotion, tenure, funding, to truly recognize and reward open science practices, transparency, and the robustness of methods is crucial.
So giving credit for sharing data and code, not just for publishing papers.
Precisely. If researchers aren't given tangible credit for the often significant extra effort required to properly document and share data and code, they simply won't prioritize it when deadlines are looming. You need the carrots as well as the sticks of policy mandates.
Makes sense. What else on the human side?
Communication is also vital. Some studies show that when evaluators or reviewers actually communicate directly with authors during an attempt to reproduce results, the success rate increases significantly.
How so?
Often, a simple clarifying question about a parameter setting or a step in the methods can resolve an issue that would otherwise make reproduction completely impossible. A little back and forth helps.
And researchers themselves, they need the skills to actually navigate all these new tools and practices, right? It's not always intuitive.
Yes, absolutely. Building skills and capacity across the entire research community is key. Researchers need training in data management, best practices, how to use repositories effectively, methods for documenting their work comprehensively, and how to use these new workflow and containerization tools.
Where should that training come from?
Capacity building activities are needed at universities, research institutions, and within professional societies. Workshops, tutorials, online resources.
And this really requires different disciplines to work together too, doesn't it? Geoscientists and computer scientists, for example.
Definitely. Close collaboration between computer scientists, data scientists, and the domain scientists, the geoscientists themselves in this case, is essential.
Why?
To build tools that are both computationally powerful and genuinely user-friendly, integrating seamlessly into researchers' existing workflows rather than adding a huge extra burden. Workflow management systems, for example, can also foster collaboration by providing a shared, structured framework for multi-investigator projects.
With all these new initiatives and policies popping up, how do we actually know if they're effective? Are they working?
That's a great question. They really need to be iteratively evaluated and improved based on evidence. We can't just launch them and assume they work perfectly.
So studying the process of science itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where meta-research, essentially research on research, is becoming increasingly important. It allows the community to use scientific methods to study and improve the scientific process itself, including reproducibility efforts. We need data on what works and what doesn't.
The sources also mentioned considering equity in this transition. What's that about?
Yes, it's a really important point that the community is, thankfully, starting to acknowledge more. As we implement these changes, we need to consider how they might impact researchers from different backgrounds or institutions, particularly underrepresented groups. We need to ensure that new policies and practices don't inadvertently create new barriers or exacerbate existing inequities. For example, by requiring access to specific, expensive software, high-performance computing resources, or levels of technical expertise that aren't universally available globally or across all institutions. We need to be mindful of that.
So despite all this exciting progress and the clear vision for a more transparent future, it's definitely not a done deal. There are still significant roadblocks on the path forward.
Yes, there certainly are. One major hurdle that keeps coming up is integration. While many excellent tools exist for different parts of the reproducibility puzzle, data repositories, code platforms, workflow systems, container tools,
Right, we've discussed many of them.
they aren't always well integrated into a single smooth workflow that scientists can easily adopt without becoming expert software engineers themselves. This fragmentation adds complexity and burden.
It sounds like the individual researcher still often has to be the glue holding all these different pieces together.
Often, yes. And even when data or scripts are shared, ensuring true reusability remains a persistent challenge.
Even if you can find it.
Yes. Issues with the completeness of the shared material, maybe a crucial input file is missing. Lack of clear documentation, making it hard to understand what the code does or how the data was collected, or even simple frustrating things like hard-coded file paths in a script that only work on the original author's computer. All these can still hinder reuse even if the files are technically available.
I've definitely clicked on links in online supplementary materials sections of papers from a few years ago, only to find they lead nowhere, a 404 error.
That highlights the critical issue of persistence, exactly. Relying solely on online supplementary materials linked from a journal's website is common, but those links are notoriously fragile. They often break over time as websites get reorganized or journals change platforms.
So repositories are better.
Dedicated repositories, especially those assigning persistent identifiers like DOIs, offer much better long-term persistence and reliable access. They are designed for archival.
And that legacy code issue you mentioned earlier, the old Fortran model.
That remains a significant challenge. Recovering, understanding, and updating older code bases can be very difficult, sometimes truly requiring access to old software or operating system environments that are hard to find or set up today. It takes real effort, sometimes archaeological effort.
So achieving widespread reproducibility and transparency isn't just a matter of adopting a few new tools. It sounds like it's a really complex, ongoing effort involving technology, people, and culture.
Absolutely. It requires careful planning from the start of a project, significant dedicated effort from individual researchers and their institutions, and perhaps most importantly, a fundamental shift in the culture and the incentive structures within the scientific community. It's definitely a marathon, not a sprint.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. The challenges, the vision, the history, the concrete steps being taken, the human element, and the remaining hurdles. Let's bring it back to the listener. Why does all of this detailed discussion about geoscience's reproducibility actually matter to you, the listener, the curious learner?
Well, for one thing, understanding these principles gives you, I think, much deeper insight into the very foundation upon which scientific conclusions are built.
How so?
When you see a scientific claim, especially one based on complex data and computations, think about climate change projections or natural hazard assessments. Knowing whether the underlying data and methods are available for scrutiny gives you a solid basis for evaluating its trustworthiness. You can ask, is this verifiable?
It also potentially opens up a pathway for your own curiosity and learning, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. If research data and methods are openly available and well documented, you might actually be able to access and reuse them yourself, maybe for exploration, for learning a new technique, or even for building your own analysis or visualizations based on that public work.
It also sounds like it sharpens your critical thinking skills when consuming science news or information.
Definitely. You can start asking more informed questions about the scientific information you encounter. Are the data and methods behind this finding actually available? Could someone else realistically verify these results? Or is it a black box?
So understanding these concepts just helps you navigate the sheer volume of scientific information that's out there today. You gain a better sense of what makes research reliable and robust in this digital landscape.
Exactly. And ultimately remember that these efforts are about making science more reliable, more efficient, and hopefully accelerating progress on some of the most critical issues facing humanity. Like understanding and mitigating climate change, predicting and preparing for natural hazards like earthquakes or floods, or managing vital resources like water and energy. Better science leads to better decisions.
So to recap this deep dive then, we've seen that while geoscientific research faces some really significant challenges in becoming fully reproducible and transparent in this digital age, there's also incredible momentum and a lot of innovation happening right now.
Absolutely. From journals adopting new open data policies and communities organizing specific reproducibility challenges, to developing these comprehensive visions for the future of scientific papers like the GPF,
Right.
and building innovative tools for managing data, software, and workflows more effectively. The field is actively working towards a more open, more trustworthy, and hopefully more collaborative future.
It's clearly an evolving landscape, isn't it? Constantly improving, hopefully. Which leads to a final thought. If research products do become truly findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, truly fair, it really makes you wonder, what new connections, what unexpected insights, what new discoveries might be waiting just around the corner for you, the curious learner, to find and build upon in this increasingly transparent world of science?